Late winter 1945. The war was over, but the cold didn't care. In the ruins of a former Japanese military outpost, rows of narrow cells stood half-buried in snow. Inside, women sat on concrete floors wrapped in thin, torn uniforms. Their breath formed clouds in the air. Some were nurses once. Others had worked for the army or simply been in the wrong place when surrender came. Now they waited, uncertain, shivering, forgotten. Outside, an American truck rumbled through the silence. Its tires cracked the frost underfoot. The guards inside the camp stiffened, expecting another inspection. But when the truck doors opened, no rifles appeared. Only bundles of thick army coats carried by young soldiers barely older than the women behind the bars. The prisoners stared, unsure if it was a trick. Then one soldier knelt, sliding a coat through the rusted bars. The fabric fell at a woman's feet. Her hands trembled as she touched it. Warmth for the first time in months. It wasn't victory or surrender anymore. It was something quieter, something human, and it began in the cold silence of a ruined winter morning. By the end of 1945, Japan was a nation on its knees. Cities that once hummed with life had become silent fields of rubble. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya all had been firebombed to ash. Rail lines barely worked, food was disappearing, and disease was spreading through refugee camps faster than medicine could arrive. For years, Japan's leaders had promised glory through sacrifice. But when Emperor Hirohito's voice broke through the radio in August 1945, declaring surrender, that illusion shattered. Millions listened in stunned silence. For the first time, the God Emperor had spoken, and his words meant defeat. As American forces began to occupy the islands, they stepped into a country broken in both body and spirit. Under General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied command sought not just to disarm Japan, but to rebuild it, to transform an empire into a democracy. But rebuilding meant control, and control meant detention. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, officials, and civilians with military ties were rounded up for questioning. Among them were women, clerks, translators, nurses, and members of patriotic groups who had served the state during the war. Many weren't soldiers at all, yet they were placed in holding centers and prison camps until their roles could be reviewed. The women were frightened, exhausted, and often sick. They had grown up hearing that surrender meant humiliation worse than death. Now they found themselves under the watch of the very enemy they had been told was inhuman. The American occupation forces, meanwhile, faced their own struggle. Most of the young U.S. soldiers had fought in the Pacific, on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Philippines, where mercy was rare and hatred ran deep. They arrived expecting revenge, not reconstruction, but the war's end confronted them with a different kind of battlefield, one filled with starving civilians and orphans, not armed soldiers. The detention centers scattered across Japan became grim symbols of that uneasy transition. Many were converted military barracks or damaged police stations with little heat or sanitation. Winter crept in early that year, and by December, temperatures in parts of Honshu dropped below freezing. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, surviving on thin rice gruel and hope that someone still remembered them. In this harsh new world, compassion seemed almost impossible. Yet within these same ruins, small acts of humanity began to appear. Quiet gestures that spoke louder than victory. And one of those moments would happen when the cold was at its worst. The first winter after Japan's surrender was one of the coldest on record. By November 1945, coal shipments had stopped in many parts of the country and wood was scarce. Civilians burned furniture, doors, and even books to keep warm. In the detention centers, where Japanese prisoners of war and collaborators were held, the cold was merciless. For the American occupation forces, this was a new kind of war, one against hunger, disease, and despair. The mission came from the top: rebuild Japan, but do it without losing the moral high ground. General MacArthur made it clear that cruelty would not be tolerated. "We are not here to destroy," he said. "We are here to build." Still, rebuilding an entire nation was chaotic. The prisons and holding camps were filled with people the Americans barely understood. Men and women accused of helping the war machine, but not always guilty of crimes. Many were nurses, clerks, and teachers who had simply followed orders. In the confusion of occupation, it was easier to detain first and question later. The women suffered the most. Food rations were cut to the bone. Blankets were almost non-existent. They wrapped themselves in torn uniforms and paper sheets, huddling in groups to share body heat. Some guards pitied them, others looked away, and yet inside those cold walls a silent question hung in the air. What did mercy mean after a war like this? Outside the camps, the U.S. military was wrestling with its own conscience. The memories of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Guadalcanal were still raw. Many soldiers had lost brothers and friends in the Pacific. To them, Japan was not just defeated. It was responsible for unbearable pain. But when they saw the reality on the ground, mothers feeding children with handfuls of rice, women prisoners too weak to stand, and something began to shift. The American Red Cross and Army Medical Unit started distributing food and supplies, not just to civilians, but even to prisoners. Some soldiers volunteered to help, driven less by orders than by instinct. Reports began circulating of small kindnesses, GIs sharing rations, medics treating enemy wounds, and winter clothes quietly delivered to camps where prisoners were freezing. These gestures were never official policy. They were human reactions to suffering. That was how, one morning in early 1946, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks rolled toward a women's detention camp near Yokohama. Inside were not weapons or guards, but piles of heavy army coats. It would be a simple act. Yet in that moment, it would bridge the widest gap a war had ever made, between enemies and between hate and compassion. The human angle. The women held inside the Yokohama camp were not warriors in the usual sense. Most had been nurses, clerks, or teachers swept into the machinery of total war. Some had followed their husbands to military posts. Others had served in patriotic women's groups that supported the army. When Japan surrendered, they became suspects, reminders of the regime America had just defeated. Inside the camp, they lived with hunger and silence. Days passed with no news, no trials, and almost no heat. They used torn cloth to wrap their feet and rubbed their hands together until the skin cracked. Many had lost everything, homes burned, families missing, futures gone. Their pride had kept them alive during the war. Now it only deepened their shame. Yet even here they clung to a sense of dignity. They lined up for roll calls, swept the cold floors, and whispered prayers at night. They were prisoners, but still human, still capable of hope even if they barely admitted it. The soldier's angle. For the American guards and supply units, the situation was complex. They were young men who had spent years being told the Japanese were monsters. In training films and propaganda posters, Japan had been painted as ruthless, fanatical, and alien. Many of these soldiers had seen friends die because of that war. But now, as they looked into the cells, they saw something they hadn't expected. Fear. Not the fear of soldiers, but of people simply trying to survive. Some of the guards wrote home about it. They looked like ghosts, one private noted in a letter. I didn't think I'd ever feel sorry for them, but I do. It was a strange kind of victory, one that forced both sides to confront what the war had taken from them. For the Americans, it meant learning that mercy could be harder than combat. For the Japanese women, it meant seeing kindness from men they had been told were demons. The cultural angle. The clash between American and Japanese culture made every encounter uncertain. In Japanese tradition, surrender carried deep shame. To live as a prisoner was almost unbearable, a wound to honor itself. The women rarely met their captors' eyes. They bowed even when shivering, still clinging to the discipline they had been taught since childhood. The Americans didn't understand this at first. To them, offering food or help was simple compassion. But to the women, accepting it was both relief and humiliation. Some refused blankets out of pride. Others wept quietly when no one was watching. This silent exchange, pride against mercy, defined much of the early occupation. Every act of kindness had to cross an invisible wall of pain, guilt, and memory. Yet each time a soldier handed over a coat or a nurse offered medicine, that wall cracked a little more. And through those cracks, something began to change, not in policy, but in heart. The moral angle. For both sides, the war had blurred the meaning of right and wrong. In the Pacific, mercy had been seen as weakness. Soldiers were trained to destroy, not to feel. But when the fighting stopped, that mindset didn't vanish overnight. American troops now guarded people who had once been their sworn enemies. some who had cheered the war that killed their friends. The question hung unspoken. Did they deserve compassion? Among the American officers, opinions were divided. Some argued that discipline came first, that pity could soften the image of victory. Others believed that real strength meant rising above vengeance. When the Coats arrived at the women's camp, that moral debate played out in silence. There was no speech, no ceremony, then only action. A Coat passed through iron bars said more about justice than any order ever could. Each gesture was small, but it carried weight. For the women, it meant survival. For the soldiers, it meant a return to humanity. The historical angle acts like these didn't happen in isolation. Across Japan, similar moments of quiet compassion appeared as the U.S. occupation deepened. American Red Cross teams delivered medical aid to civilians. Army engineers helped rebuild homes. Female U.S. nurses treated Japanese mothers and children. What had started as a military presence slowly became a humanitarian mission. This approach set a historical precedent. Instead of crushing the defeated enemy, the United States rebuilt it, a decision that would shape the next 70 years of global politics. In 1945, that idea was still fragile, but every small act of mercy, every blanket or meal shared, became a seed of something larger: reconciliation. The psychological angle for the Japanese women, the Coats became more than warmth. They were proof that the world still held kindness. Many of them had lost faith in everything they knew: their government, their emperor, even their gods. When an American soldier, the enemy, offered comfort instead of punishment, it shattered the image they had been taught. And for the Americans, it was healing too. Many soldiers had carried hatred since the first battles of the Pacific. Helping these women allowed them to let go of some of that weight. They weren't forgiving the war, just reclaiming their own sense of humanity after years of violence. When the Coats spread across the camp, brown wool against gray rags, something invisible shifted. The guards no longer saw prisoners. The women no longer saw monsters, and that fragile understanding set the stage for one quiet morning that would turn a small act of mercy into a story history would almost forget. It was early January 1946. The snow outside Yokohama had hardened into a white crust, and the air bit at the skin like glass. Inside the women's detention camp, the prisoners barely moved anymore. Frost formed along the cell walls. Breath came out as mist, then faded into the cold. The guards had given them whatever scraps they could spare, thin blankets, bits of newspaper, but it wasn't enough. At dawn, the rumble of truck engines echoed across the frozen yard. The women stirred, pulling their rags tighter, expecting another inspection or transfer. Instead, they saw something strange. A convoy of U.S. Army trucks, their sides marked not with weapons crates but with white medical symbols. Soldiers climbed down, not in combat gear but in thick parkas and gloves. They carried bundles wrapped in tarps. The camp commandant, an American major, spoke quietly with the Japanese interpreter. Then, without fanfare, the gates opened. The soldiers walked inside. No one shouted. No rifles were raised. They simply began unloading the bundles. Out spilled dozens of olive drab army coats. Men's coats, heavy and worn from service, but whole. The women didn't move at first. They watched in silence, unsure if this was punishment disguised as mercy. One woman, a former nurse named Ishida, later recalled that she thought it must be a test race, that taking the coat might bring shame or accusation. But then one of the soldiers smiled, just faintly, and placed a coat on the ground near her feet. For a moment she froze, then she reached out, trembling, and lifted it. The wool felt impossibly heavy, rough against her hands, but warm. She pressed it against her chest and began to cry. Not loudly, but the kind of cry that comes when a person no longer has words. One by one, the others followed. The Americans passed the coats through the bars, careful, gentle. Some even bowed slightly, awkwardly in return for the prisoners' quiet nods. The yard filled with the soft sound of fabric and footsteps, the sound of something rare, peace. A soldier later wrote in his diary, "They looked at us like they didn't understand what kindness was. Maybe we didn't either, not until that day. By noon, every woman had a coat. Some smiled for the first time in months. Others stood still, clutching the sleeves as if afraid to let go. The soldiers didn't stay for thanks. They finished the delivery and left as quietly as they had arrived. In the silence that followed, the women looked at each other. For the first time since the war ended, the cold no longer felt endless. Something had changed, not in the weather, but in the space between enemies. In the days that followed, word of what happened at the Yokohama camp began to spread, first among the prisoners, then among nearby civilians. No official report was filed, no ceremony held. Yet the story moved quietly from person to person, carried in whispers and memories. The Americans had brought coats to the women prisoners. In a nation still haunted by defeat, that simple act meant more than food or warmth. It was a sign that the world outside the camp walls had not forgotten mercy. Some of the women later said it was the first time they believed they might live to see freedom again. American officers took note too. The major in charge of the delivery mentioned it in a dispatch, writing that the conditions were severe and morale low. Supplies were issued to prevent loss of life. He didn't call it charity and just necessity, but those who witnessed it understood it was more than that. In nearby villages, Japanese civilians who had once feared the occupation began approaching American aid posts without trembling. A few even brought small gifts, paper cranes, carved trinkets, and flowers to thank the soldiers. The gesture rippled outward, softening the edges of hostility. Within weeks, more shipments arrived, blankets, soap, and medical supplies distributed to other camps and hospitals. Some soldiers even used their pay to buy extra clothing from the black market to hand out discreetly. For them, the war had ended not with surrender, but with these small redemptive acts. One corporal wrote home that he had finally seen something worth fighting for, not victory, but peace. Another described how the women lined up in their new coats for roll call, standing straighter than before, as if dignity had returned to them. For Japan, the winter of 1946 remained one of hunger and ruin, but beneath the hardship, a fragile understanding began to grow, that compassion could survive even the darkest war. The soldiers went back to their bases. The prisoners returned to their cells and snow kept falling across the yard, but the coats stayed. Reminders of a moment when enemies stopped being enemies, if only for a breath. That quiet transformation marked the true end of the war, not on paper, but in the hearts of those who had lived it. By February 1946, the immediate shock of surrender had faded, but the consequences of the war and occupation were still very real. Japanese cities were slowly beginning to rebuild, but for the prisoners in camps like Yokohama, life remained harsh. Records from the U.S. Army show that female detainees were provided with basic rations, clothing, and medical care, yet overcrowding and disease continued to claim lives. Survivors later described the small comforts, a hot meal, a coat, a blanket, as monumental. For many, these were the first signs that the Americans were not simply conquerors but agents of stability. Women who had feared punishment for weeks found themselves able to sleep without the terror of sudden inspections or verbal abuse. Their health gradually improved, though many bore long-term effects of malnutrition and frostbite. The American soldiers involved also reflected on the experience. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a mixture of pride, unease, and relief. Some questioned why they were showing compassion to people who had once been portrayed as enemies. Yet nearly all recognized the human necessity of these gestures. This marked a subtle but important shift in occupation policy. Acts of kindness were no longer rare exceptions. They were becoming expected in the treatment of prisoners and civilians alike. Across Japan, other camps took note. Prisoners in different regions began to receive similar assistance, blankets, coats, and medical attention, creating a standard that would help prevent further deaths from exposure during the winter. The ripple effect demonstrated how one small act could influence the broader occupation strategy, shaping the relationship between occupiers and the occupied. And through it all, the memory of that first delivery of coats at Yokohama lingered in the minds of both the women and the soldiers, a symbol of the fragile hope that even after destruction, human decency could survive. By the spring of 1946, the occupation of Japan had begun to take a more structured form. The U.S. Army, working alongside the Red Cross and local authorities, implemented programs to rebuild schools, hospitals, and essential infrastructure. For the women who had survived the harsh winter in detention, life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. Some were released outright, while others were reassigned to work in hospitals, schools, or administrative offices under supervision. Those who had received the coats carried with them a lasting memory of that winter morning. It became a personal testament to the possibility of kindness in a world dominated by war and suspicion. Survivors later recounted how the simple act of warmth restored their faith in humanity, helping them endure the lingering challenges of ration shortages, cold nights, and bureaucratic uncertainty. The American soldiers who had participated in these acts of mercy returned home with their own stories. Letters and memoirs reflected a recognition that war was not only about victory or defeat, but about the humanity preserved in its aftermath. These personal experiences contributed to a broader understanding within the U.S. military that humane treatment of prisoners could facilitate smoother occupation, reduce resistance, and foster reconciliation. On a larger scale, the gesture symbolized the beginning of a new relationship between Japan and the United States, one built not only on power and oversight, but on gestures of respect and care. The winter coats became a metaphor, quietly influencing post-war policy, attitudes, and even Japan's gradual acceptance of the American presence as a stabilizing, rather than punitive force. The coats, the care and the small acts of mercy during that harsh winter, left their mark. They were not headlines nor battles recorded in strategy manuals, but they reshaped the hearts of those involved, setting a precedent for what post-war justice and humanity could look like. And from that quiet winter of 1945 to 46, a lesson emerged, one that would carry forward into the reflection on the meaning of mercy after war. The story of the Japanese women who received winter coats in a freezing detention camp is small in the scale of World War II, yet enormous in its significance. It reminds us that even amid the devastation of war, humanity can survive, often in the quietest gestures. War teaches cruelty and endurance. It hardens hearts and blurs lines between right and wrong. But in that frozen yard outside Yokohama, a soldier's simple act of passing a coat through the bars reminded both sides of something older and deeper. Empathy does not belong to the victors alone. It belongs to everyone who chooses it. For the women, the coat was warmth and protection, but it was also recognition, a confirmation that their suffering mattered. For the soldiers, it was a chance to reclaim a measure of their own humanity, to respond to pain not with vengeance but with care. In that instant, enemies became human beings sharing a common need: survival. Moments like this are often forgotten in the grand narratives of war. Yet they shape the aftermath, the relationships between nations, and the moral compass of history. The coats did not change the course of battles, but they changed the course of lives. They became symbols of hope, mercy, and the possibility of rebuilding not just a nation, but trust. And as winter gave way to spring, the lesson remained: even in the coldest, darkest times, compassion can create warmth that lasts far beyond the snow.